15 million people. That's roughly how many Kurds live inside Iran, close to a tenth of the entire country's population. For months now, 5 of their political parties have been united under a single coalition with one stated goal, written into their own founding statement, toppling the Iranian regime. The CIA and Mossad reportedly built an entire offensive around them. Trump personally called their leaders, and then the whole plan collapsed in leaks, in distrust, and in denials from the Kurdish groups themselves. Tonight, we're going to walk through exactly what happened, because the real story is stranger, messier, and more revealing about the actual state of this war than the version that made headlines back in March. Here's what's coming. We're going to trace how Iran's Kurdish parties went from scattered protest support to a formally united coalition calling for regime change. We're going to walk through the CIA and Mossad's actual plan to arm them, confirmed by 3 separate major outlets, and exactly why Trump pulled back from it within days. We're going to break down the confused, contradictory reporting from early March, when multiple networks claimed a Kurdish ground offensive had already started, and what actually happened when reporters tried to verify it. And we're going to end with what's happening in Kurdish areas of Iran right now, this week, because the regime hasn't stopped targeting them, and it hasn't stopped executing protesters either. So stick with me, because this story didn't end in March. It's still unfolding. But let's start with where this actually begins, because Kurdish resistance to the Islamic Republic isn't a new phenomenon born out of this specific war. It goes back to the very beginning of the regime itself. After the 1979 revolution, Ayatollah Khomeini proclaimed what was described at the time as a holy war against the Kurds, a campaign that led to the deaths of thousands of Kurdish people in the years that followed. Over the following decades, most of Iran's Kurdish political parties were pushed into exile in the Kurdistan region of Iraq, where some of them fought alongside Iraqi Kurdish forces against the Islamic State, receiving training from American forces in the process. Iran periodically struck those exiled parties even in their new Iraqi bases, including missile strikes in 2018 and again in 2022. So by the time this current crisis started, you already had a population with generations of grievance, a network of armed political parties with real combat experience, and a documented history of Iran treating Kurdish opposition as a direct security threat worth striking across an international border. The current chapter of the story opens on January 5th, 2026. According to the Wikipedia tracker documenting what's now formally called the 2026 Kurdish-Iranian crisis, several Iranian Kurdish parties issued a joint statement calling for a general strike to be held on January 8th in Kurdish areas, as part of the broader wave of nationwide Iranian protests that had been building since late December. That strike call worked. According to Hengal, a human rights organization tracking events in the region, the strike was observed in more than 50 cities and towns, including across Kermanshah province, Kurdistan province, and West Azerbaijan province. In the Kurdish majority areas of Abdanan and Malikshahi in Ilam province, described as among the centers of the protests, entire towns were reported to have fallen into the hands of protesters after Iranian security forces simply abandoned their positions. Analysts describe that specific moment as a major success for the Kurdish parties, demonstrating a level of mobilization not seen since the Mahsa Amini protests years earlier. That success came at an enormous human cost, one worth stating plainly before we go any further. According to eyewitness accounts and independent journalists cited by Fair Observer, in the city of Malikshahi alone on January 3rd, a day that became known locally as Bloody Saturday, at least 5 Kurdish citizens were killed, roughly 40 were injured, and many more were arrested. The Kurdistan Human Rights Network later documented 240 Kurdish deaths connected to the broader 2026 protests, while Hengal separately confirmed the identities of 257 Kurdish protesters killed specifically during the December wave of unrest. Those are not small numbers, and they represent real families, real names, and real communities absorbing the brunt of a security crackdown that hit Kurdish regions especially hard. During those same January protests, some Kurdish parties moved beyond strikes and demonstrations into direct armed action. The Kurdistan Freedom Party, known as PAK, told the Associated Press it had launched attacks against Iran's Revolutionary Guard in retaliation for the crackdown on protesters. According to reporting tracked in the Wikipedia timeline, PAK claimed on January 10th that its fighters had injured 3 IRGC members in Nurabad, in Lorestan province, and separately claimed to have killed 6 IRGC members in another incident that same day. On January 11th, PAK claimed additional attacks in Kermanshah and Isfahan, and on January 13th, another strike on an IRGC position in Kermanshah. A second group, the Kurdistan Free Life Party, known as PJAK, was separately linked by Iran-aligned Fars news agency to clashes that killed 8 IRGC members in Kermanshah, while a PJAK sniper allegedly killed a police officer in Ilam province. Iran's own IRGC-aligned Tasnim news agency stated at the time that Kurdish groups, including PKK, had, in its words, entered the field phase of the protests through coordinated action. That's the Iranian regime's own state media confirming these groups had moved from political support into active combat operations. That momentum led directly to the moment this coalition became formal. On February 22, 2026, the Coalition of Political Forces of Iranian Kurdistan, known as CPFIK, was officially formed, bringing together 5 major Iranian Kurdish parties based in the Kurdistan region of Iraq: the Democratic Party of Iranian Kurdistan, the Kurdistan Freedom Party, the Kurdistan Free Life Party, the Organization of Iranian Kurdistan Struggle, and the Kamala Party of the Toilers of Kurdistan. According to Rudah's reporting on the formation of the alliance, the coalition described its explicit aims as toppling the Iranian regime and achieving Kurdish self-determination within Iranian Kurdistan. That's not vague political posturing. That's 5 separate armed and political organizations, each with their own history and their own internal politics, formally uniting under a single declared objective: regime change. 6 days later, the broader Iran war began. According to the coalition's own statement on February 28th, representatives said they were jointly coordinating political and military decisions and preparing for what they called a new phase, claiming their forces were, in their words, deep inside Iran and along the Iran-Iraq border, ready to respond as the situation developed. Iran's government response was to revive an old counterforce, the Muslim Peshmerga, a Kurdish loyalist militia aligned with the regime rather than against it, which released statements mourning the death of Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, who had been killed in the war's opening strikes and threatening the United States, Israel, and the Kurdish opposition groups directly. That detail matters because it tells you the regime wasn't just relying on conventional military force to handle its Kurdish population. It was also trying to mobilize Kurds loyal to Tehran against Kurds opposed to it, turning this into a conflict that ran through Kurdish communities themselves, not simply between Kurds and the central government. Now here's where the story gets genuinely remarkable, because this wasn't just a regional uprising anymore. It became the subject of direct American and Israeli intelligence planning, confirmed across multiple major outlets. According to the Wall Street Journal, reporting from March 3rd, President Trump was described as open to supporting armed militias, particularly the Kurds. That reporting coincided with intensified strikes in Kurdish majority areas of western Iran targeting police stations, border posts, and other security facilities. Strikes some sources suggested may have been paving the way for a Kurdish advance. By March 7th, according to Hengo's tracking, strikes in Iranian Kurdistan had destroyed 40 separate sites in Sanandaj alone, the largest city in Iranian Kurdistan, with additional targets hit across Kermanshah, Elam, Mehran, Paver, Karendi Garb, Bukan, Mahabad, Oshnavia, Sakez, Sarpol-e-Zahab, Miandoab, and Bane. Those strikes hit IRGC barracks, intelligence facilities, military and police bases, and multiple border guard commands. According to Hengo, the scale of that bombing forced IRGC and border guard units in parts of Kermanshah province to evacuate into civilian locations, including hospitals. CNN independently confirmed the intelligence angle directly. According to CNN's reporting from March 3rd, the CIA was actively working to arm Kurdish forces, specifically to spark an uprising inside Iran. Axios added the origin story behind that effort, reporting that the idea of using Iranian Kurdish factions as a ground force for a possible offensive from Iraq into Iran had originated with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Mossad, with the CIA joining the effort afterward. According to ITV News, weapons had reportedly been smuggled into Western Iran since the previous year's 12-day war, specifically to arm thousands of Kurdish volunteers, with Kurdish sources telling the outlet that American and Israeli forces had been asked to provide air cover once any ground operation actually began. Trump's personal involvement went beyond just general policy support. According to Axios, just days after the war began, Trump held direct calls with Masoud Barzani and Bafel Talabani, the leaders of the Kurdistan region of Iraq's 2 main political parties, discussing what were described as sensitive topics, as well as a separate call with Mustafa Hijri, the leader of the Democratic Party of Iranian Kurdistan. According to the Washington Post's reporting from March 5th, Trump offered what the paper described as extensive American air cover and other backing to anti-regime Iranian Kurdish groups, specifically to help them seize portions of western Iran. In his conversations with Kurdish leaders, Trump reportedly told them the Kurds needed to choose a side, either with America and Israel or with Iran. Members of Kurdish opposition groups affirmed those plans were real, with one telling Politico that they couldn't move unless the air above them was cleared, and specifically calling for a no-fly zone similar to the one that helped Kurds in Iraq establish genuine autonomy after 1991. So for a few days in early March, you had a real documented multi-agency plan involving the CIA, Mossad, direct presidential phone calls, smuggled weapons, and a request for American air cover, all built around using Iran's Kurdish population as the ground force in a broader effort to topple the regime. And then, almost as quickly as it appeared, it started falling apart. On March 7th and 8th, according to Iran International's reporting, Trump reversed his own public position. He told reporters he did not want Kurdish fighters to enter the war in Iran, saying the conflict was already, in his words, complicated enough, and that he did not want to see Kurds get hurt or killed. That's a striking reversal within less than a week of offering extensive air cover and telling Kurdish leaders to pick a side. According to a later report from Israel's Channel 12, cited in the Times of Israel at the end of March, there had been actual plans for a coordinated Kurdish offensive involving all 6 major Kurdish factions, but numerous problems led both Mossad and the CIA to ultimately end the effort. One specific attempt was aborted entirely after the plans leaked, prompting Iran to fortify its defenses in direct response. The Times of Israel reported that Israel's own military intelligence directorate had been skeptical of the plan from early on. According to Turkey's Daily Sabah, pressure from the Turkish government on both Trump and the Kurdistan regional government ultimately helped bring the American-backed offensive to a halt, and later reporting from Israeli outlet Ynet, published in June, added that Mossad had reportedly armed Kurdish fighters using weapons originally seized from Hamas and Hezbollah before Trump's decision shut the broader plan down. That collapse matters enormously for understanding why the situation looks the way it does today, because it tells you the most ambitious version of this story, a coordinated foreign-backed Kurdish ground offensive actually toppling the regime from the inside. Never actually happened. But confusion about whether it had happened anyway spread fast. And this next part of the story is a genuinely important lesson in how quickly unverified claims can spiral during an active war. On March 4th, according to the Wikipedia timeline, several outlets reported that a Kurdish-led ground offensive had already begun. Israeli-run I-24 News specifically reported that PJAK fighters were moving into positions around the southern mountains of Maravan in Iran's Kurdistan province, attributing that claim to an unnamed official with no footage provided to back it up. Barak Ravid, a well-known reporter for Channel 12, initially cited a U.S. official confirming the offensive was underway, then walked that back within a day, saying there were now conflicting reports. On March 5th, PJAK, PDKI, PAK, and Kamala, 4 of the 5 major coalition parties, all denied that any Kurdish offensive inside Iran had actually started. Aziz Ahmed, an official with the Kurdistan region of Iraq's government, stated flatly that not a single Iraqi Kurd had crossed the border. Iran's own IRGC rejected the entire story as, in its words, subversive. That sequence is worth sitting with carefully because it's a textbook case of how a war story can spiral out ahead of the actual facts. An unnamed official's claim gets reported by one outlet. A well-connected journalist cites confirmation from a U.S. official. Within 24 hours, the same journalist is walking that confirmation back to conflicting reports. And within another day, every single Kurdish party actually involved, along with an Iraqi Kurdish regional official, is directly denying the story ever happened at all. If you were only watching headlines from March 4th, you'd have walked away believing a full-scale Kurdish invasion of Iran was already underway. By March 5th, the entire premise had collapsed under its own weight. That doesn't mean nothing was happening on the ground, though, and this is exactly the kind of distinction that matters. According to that same Wikipedia tracker, a PDKI political analyst stated on March 2nd that the party's forces had targeted Iranian military and security facilities, including missile facilities, inside Iran itself. Real strikes were happening. Real Kurdish fighters were engaged in real operations against Iranian regime targets. What wasn't happening, according to every party actually involved, was the large-scale, coordinated ground invasion that some early, poorly sourced reporting had described. Small-scale operations and cross-border strikes are a very different category of event than a full offensive, and conflating the two is exactly the kind of error that undermines trust in war coverage generally. The retaliation for even this smaller-scale Kurdish activity was severe. Iran, in what appeared to be a preemptive move, targeted Kurdish party positions with missile and drone strikes across the Kurdistan region of Iraq. On March the 2nd, PAK announced that 2 of its bases in Erbil had been targeted, a strike that killed at least 1 PAK fighter. According to Rudaw, Erbil itself was hit with over 70 missiles and drones in a single wave. On March 6th, Iran issued a direct threat to target all facilities across the Kurdistan region of Iraq if Kurdish militants were allowed to enter Iran by Iraqi authorities, prompting officials of the Kurdistan regional government to repeatedly emphasize they did not want to become involved in the conflict at all, calling instead for de-escalation. Kurdistan expert Vladimir von Wilgenberg argued that American air defenses had likely been quietly expanded specifically to protect areas used by Iranian Kurdish parties, pointing to relatively low casualty figures compared to the sheer number of missiles and drones Iran was firing into the region. Even after the broader 2026 Iran war ceasefire took hold, this specific front didn't fully go quiet. According to Iran International's reporting from mid-April, Iraqi Kurdistan had been hit 16 separate times since the ceasefire began, meaning Iranian strikes against Kurdish opposition positions continued even during a period when the broader war between Iran and the United States was technically paused. On April 5th, the CPFIK coalition formally denied claims made by Trump that it had received weapons originally intended for protesters inside Iran, while Trump separately claimed in comments reported by the New York Post that the Iranian regime had killed 45,000 of its own citizens, a figure that has not been independently verified by outside human rights organizations and should be understood as Trump's own claim rather than a confirmed casualty count. So where does all of this actually leave the Kurdish uprising as of right now? Here's the part of this story that almost nobody covering it from back in March has followed up on. According to reporting from PJ Media, published just yesterday, Iran launched a fresh large-scale wave of strikes against Kurdish positions, described by open-source intelligence tracker OSINT Defender as notable specifically for its size and scale compared to recent activity. That same report noted the account's own assessment that Iran has continued indiscriminately targeting Kurdish positions, describing it as consistent with a pattern the regime has maintained throughout its history. At the exact same time, Iranian authorities have been preparing to execute up to 4 political protesters. According to that same reporting, 3 specific individuals, Amir Hossein Safari, Abolfazl Sepahi, and Alireza Sepahi, were sentenced to death for taking part in January's anti-regime protests, with security forces and protesters reported clashing in the streets of Isfahan as those executions loom. Protests over those planned executions have themselves become a fresh trigger for renewed unrest, even as the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps remains deployed in the streets to suppress exactly that kind of response. So here's the honest, accurate picture, and it's worth being precise about it rather than reaching for the cleanest possible headline. Iran's Kurdish population absolutely did join the broader anti-regime protest movement in massive, well-documented numbers, observed across more than 50 cities in a single coordinated strike action. 5 major Kurdish political parties absolutely did unite under a single coalition with regime change as its explicitly stated goal. Real armed operations against IRGC targets absolutely did happen, claimed, and in some cases confirmed by Iran's own state media. The CIA and Mossad absolutely did build a real plan to arm and support a Kurdish-led offensive, with direct involvement from President Trump himself. But the regime has not been toppled. The most ambitious version of that plan, a coordinated multi-faction ground offensive, collapsed amid leaks, mutual distrust between Washington and the Kurdish factions, and pressure from Turkey before it ever fully launched. Reports that it had already succeeded turned out to be unverified and were directly denied by every Kurdish party supposedly involved. And as of this week, Iran is still striking Kurdish positions, still preparing executions of protesters, and still very much in power. That's not a story about defeat, and it's not a story about victory either. It's a story about a genuine, sustained, costly uprising that reshaped how seriously outside powers took Iran's Kurdish population as a political and military force, without yet producing the outcome its own coalition explicitly declared as its goal back in February. Whether that changes depends on factors that are still actively unfolding right now, this week, in the streets of Sanandaj and Isfahan alike. What do you think happens next? Does the renewed wave of strikes and executions reignite the kind of coordinated uprising that nearly happened back in March? Or does the collapse of the original CIA and Mossad plan mean Iran's Kurdish opposition is fighting this fight largely on its own from here forward? Let me know what you think in the comments. Every claim in this video traces back to named verifiable reporting, the Wikipedia tracker for the 2026 Kurdish-Iranian crisis, and its full sourcing chain, Henga's documented casualty figures, and strike tracking, FAIR. Observers reporting on the January protests, Rudah's coverage of the CPFIK coalition's formation and the strikes across Iranian Kurdistan, the Associated Press's reporting on PAK's claimed attacks, the Wall Street Journals and Washington Post's reporting on Trump's outreach to Kurdish leaders, CNN's and Axios's reporting on the CIA and Mossad's arming effort, the Times of Israel's reporting on the plan's collapse, Iran International's reporting on Trump's reversal and the post-ceasefire strikes, and PJ Media's reporting on this week's renewed strikes and planned executions. Where reports conflicted, including the disputed early claims of an active ground offensive, every party's denial was presented directly rather than resolved into a single, cleaner narrative. Because the true state of an uprising, this complicated, only holds together if the confirmed and the unconfirmed never get blurred together.